All right, so we're back and we are on the hunt for justice. This is the one that's left over. Remember the strategy there, right? Find the first three virtues in the city, and then we'll be able to find the last one. It'll be the one that is there when we found the others, the only thing remaining. Um, and then we'll be able to look at the soul and see where the virtues are found in the soul. We'll find justice in the soul and be able to say why it's better to be just than merely to seem to be just, and answer the challenges that um, Glaucon made to Socrates and the idea of justice in Book 2. All right. The place really appears to be hard going and steeped in shadows. At least it's dark and hard to search out. Remember, I think I told you at one point in an earlier video, probably Book 1, we should look out for metaphors that Plato often uses: light and shadows, darkness and light, and also this notion of difficulty. All of this is pointing to a larger picture um, that we'll see in a later book in much greater detail. If you're reading ahead, when it's an allusion to the allegory of the cave. But anyway, so it appears to be hard going and steeped in shadows. At least it's dark and hard to search out. So the idea here also um, is that education, the kind of education that the young men Polemarchus, Glaucon, and Adeimantus are receiving, is difficult and it's dark. All right, they need light, right? And I caught sight of it and said, "Here, here, Glaucon." What did he catch sight of? Justice. And I caught sight of it. Here, here, Glaucon. Maybe we've come upon a track, and in my opinion, it will hardly get away from us. So there, Socrates, the philosophical hunter, has captured sight of justice, and he doesn't think it's going to get away. It appears, you blessed man, that it's been rolling around our feet from the beginning, and we couldn't see it after all, but we're quite ridiculous. As men holding something in their hand, sometimes seek what they're holding. We, too, didn't look at it, but turned our gaze somewhere far off, which is also perhaps just the reason that it escaped our notice. So the implication here is that Socrates is saying that we've had justice right there all along. It was rolling around by our feet, or we've had it in our hand all along. We've been using it, in fact, as we'll see, in order to build the city. We didn't even realize that we had justice right there the whole time. Remember that rule we set down at the beginning when they started to build the city of words? As to what must be done in everything when we were founding the city, this, or a certain form of it, is, in my opinion, justice. That each one must practice one of the functions in the city, that one for which his nature made him naturally most fit. Remember when we began to build the city, I said, "This seems like a minor point that's being made, but in fact it's a very important point." It turns out that the principle of specialization is, according to Plato through the character of Socrates, that turns out to be justice. That each one must practice one of the functions in the city, that for which his nature made him naturally most fit. And further, that justice is the minding of one's own business and not being a busybody, doing your thing and not trying to do somebody else's thing, right? Justice is minding your own business and not trying to tell other people how to run their business. You do your part in the whole and don't try and tell other people how to do their part. And we'll see that it's justice, in fact, that's the foundation of the city. And this principle turns out to be necessary for all the virtues. Um, well, then, my friend, I said, this, the practice of minding one's own business, is probably justice. After having considered moderation, courage, and prudence, This is what's left over in the city. It provided the power which all these other virtues came into being, by which all these other virtues came into being. And once having come into being, it provides them with preservation as long as it's in the city. So the relationship between justice and the other virtues is that justice provides the power by which the city gains all the other virtues. It's moderate, wise, and courageous only when those parts of the city mind their own business. When the auxiliaries, for example, um, it's wise when the when the guardians mind their business and they do their thing and they don't try and become like gentlemen farmers or merchants or make a lot of money, but when they do their thing, when they rule, when they mind their business, and when the auxiliaries, they train for war and they guard and preserve the city from enemies without and sedition from within and traitors from within. When they do their thing and don't try and do somebody else's thing, they don't try and rule or usurp the rulers, and they don't try to become rich or decide to be farmers or producers. And similarly, when the farmers and the producers, when they do their thing and they don't try and run the show or try and become military people or the police, right? When everyone does their thing, well, that's justice. When everyone minds their own business, we get all the virtues. And when they agree, so courage comes from the military part, the auxiliaries doing their thing, and wisdom comes from the guardian class doing their thing. Moderation is when all three parts, the guardians, auxiliaries, and the farmers, when they all agree on who should rule, right? And everyone does their thing. Then we have a just city. It's also, once we have the virtuous city, the beautiful city, the Kallipolis, once we have it, it's justice that preserves the virtues as a whole, all four of them, or all the other virtues. So it preserves the virtues because everyone's doing their own thing and it doesn't disrupt it. It's also necessary for them to come into being. All right, here's my silly drawing of the Kallipolis, the soul. I've written it in Greek. You do not have to know how to write it in Greek. At the top. So this is the beautiful city. This is the beautiful city, the Kallipolis. Kalos is Greek for beautiful or fine, as it's translated in our text. That'll be important actually in a later book. But it's the beautiful city. It's perfect. It's ideal. You can't visit it because it only exists in ideas. It's a city of words. You see there I have the guardians, which is the smallest bit. Auxiliaries, there's more fighters than there are guardians. And there's a lot more producers, as I'm calling them here, or farmers. This is everybody else, all other jobs, all the other poor Slavs like you and me. And then there's the guardians, which are the upper two halves, technically, but then they're the guardians properly so called, or what in our text calls the perfect guardians. Those are the rulers at the top. And it's a pyramid because it's hierarchical. And it's a pyramid because there's fewer at the top than there are at the bottom. So those are the three parts of the city. And then you see the virtues. Wisdom is in the guardian class because it's the wisdom of the guardians that make the city as a whole wise. Courage is in the auxiliary class. That's because when the military is courageous, it makes the city as a whole courageous. And temperance I have drawn on the side here because temperance is agreement on who should rule, and it's an agreement among all three groups of the city, all three classes of the city. The producers agree that they should produce or farm or whatever. The auxiliaries agree that they should carry out the orders of the guardians, and the guardians agree that they should run the show. And when you have that, you have justice, right? Which I also drew along the base because it's the foundation of the ideal city. foundation of the virtue, all the other virtues. And it is minding your own business. It's when the producers, auxiliaries, and guardians actually do their thing and don't try and do somebody else's thing. So there's, anyway, my little picture, such as it is. I hope this helps. Okay, justice in the soul. We found where justice is in the city. We found, in fact, all 4 of the cardinal virtues. That's allowed us to find justice. Now we have to find it in the soul, because that's what we're really after, right? Remember the analogy of the signs, the big sign and the little sign, or the big letters and the little letters. So we've got the big sign out there. Now we have to read off the little sign. Now let's complete the consideration by means of which we thought that, if we should attempt to see justice first in some bigger thing that possessed it, we would more easily catch sight of what it's like in one man. Are there 3 parts of the soul? So this is the tripartite, this is Plato's theory of the tripartite structure of the soul. Tripartite just means 3-parted, right? So the 3-part structure of the soul. Do we learn with one part, become spirited with another part within us, and desire the pleasures of nourishment and generation and all their kin with a 3rd part? So these are the 3 parts of the soul that are going to correspond to the 3 parts of the city. There's the part that we learn with. He's going to call this the calculating part. It's reason, we might say. And many translations translate it as reason. So we have the rational part, which corresponds to the guardians, that should rule. And then there's the spirited part. And the spirited part is the part that is courageous. It's the part that, just as the part that you learn with perhaps corresponds with the head, the part that is the spirited part that's courageous, as it were, corresponds with the chest, you might think, right? And if you consider spirited here means something like, not like a ghost or something. It means like school spirit, right? Or team spirit. It means it's that part that makes you want to run out and charge against the enemy if you were a soldier, for example, or one of the auxiliaries, right? It's that part of you. And you feel it in your chest when you are courageous. You do something that you're a little bit scared, but you run and you do it anyway. If you've seen the film Highlander, the first one, it's sort of like The Quickening, right? You don't get that unless you've seen the film, but it's sort of like, it's that part that you feel in your heart, right? And that's, as we'll see, where courage is felt. And desire, well, that's the lower part corresponding maybe to the belly, and he has here nourishment, that's the belly, and generation, which would be a little lower than the belly, right? That is your sex drive. So the pleasures of nourishment and the pleasures of sex is what he's talking about here. That's the 3rd part, which he's going to call the desiring part. It's the part that wants. The spirited part controls, and the calculating part, or reason, rules in the individual soul. Starting to make sense? Socrates argues that there is indeed 3 parts in the soul corresponding to the 3 parts of the city, kind of skipping his argument, the details of his argument for that. But you want to think of it as sort of corresponding with the head, the chest, and the stomach, and the desiring part, the spirited part, and the ruling, rational, or calculating part of the individual person. Calculating, spirited, and desiring, right? Reason, spirit, and the appetites, we might call it. Other translations put it this way: appetite rather than desiring. So we have appetites. We want stuff. And the appetitive part, the desiring part, it doesn't desire it in moderation. It just wants to get it, right? You think of if you have a box of popsicles and you want to eat all of the popsicles, right? You don't want to stop. And if it was up to the desiring part, if it was up to your appetite, you would eat the entire box, at least if you had the really awesome popsicles that my wife buys, you would wipe out the whole box in one sitting, right? Similarly, so it needs to be controlled by this spirited part. It takes a little bit of courage to control your desires, your passions, or your appetites. It takes courage and it takes spirit to overcome that. But it's not going to work if you don't have the calculating part, or your reason, controlling the spirited part, or commanding the spirited part to control your desires. Right? So this is how the soul looks. Right here. Okay, so again, we have the calculating part, the spirited part, and the appetitive or desiring part. Wisdom is pretty obviously in the calculating part. Reason, that's where wisdom is to be found. Courage, the virtue of courage, is found in the spirited part, right, in your chest, in the maybe not literally in the chest, but it's felt in the chest. And then temperance is agreement on who should rule among the three parts of your soul, right? It's when the appetitive part obeys the control of the spirited part and the spirited part follows the direction of reason, right? When they agree that, rather, not when they do it, but when they agree that that's the hierarchy, okay? Similarly, justice, similarly to the city, justice is found throughout the soul, and it's when each part actually does what it's supposed to do and doesn't try and do some other thing, or doesn't try and usurp the control or power of the other parts. When especially the desiring or appetitive part doesn't try to, doesn't overcome the control of the spirit, or when the spirited part is properly follows the commands of reason and controls the appetite, right? So I want to eat the whole box of popsicles. That's what my appetite says. Wipe them out, right? But my reason says, if you do that, what's going to happen. Your wife is going to be upset, complain, and so on and so on. So the rational thing to do would be to eat like one popsicle and save them so that you have a popsicle after supper every night of the week. But it takes something else, this third part, in the middle, as it were, to control my appetites and keep me from eating the whole box. Okay, so I'm going to pause here because to keep the video from becoming too long, we'll pick this up in the next one.